Good evening, everybody, and welcome back to a live streaming event hosted by the library, Princeton Public Library, that would be, and Labyrinth Books here in Princeton, New Jersey. My name is Janie Herman. I do public programming here at the library as a librarian, and I'm going to host tonight on behalf of the library and Labyrinth. This is one of our many events that we're doing together during these times via Crowdcast, either here on the library's streaming platform or over at Labyrinth. You should give us both a follow. You will notice on the screen that it says purchase Dress for a Dance in the Snow from Labyrinth. You can follow that link to get information about how you can order from Labyrinth. The best thing to do is to give them a call tomorrow and let them know that you were on the Crowdcast call with us tonight and that you'd like to order the book. They will give you a 10% discount and they will ship for free or make arrangements for you to pick it up at the store. But you need to call in order to get that discount. Mention this event and you will get a discount and either free shipping or arrangements to go pick up at their store from their pickup service. So please remember to do that. And also you will notice that there's a spot here to ask a question. Please feel free at any time to put your questions into the ask a question box, because at the end we will have a moderated discussion. Once I bring Monika up on the screen, I'm going to mute what's called the chat box where we've been chatting a little bit so we can all focus on the reading and on what Monika has to tell us. So without further ado, let's get going here. It's really my great pleasure to be welcoming Monika Zgustová, who is an award-winning author. Her works have been published in 10 languages. She was born in Prague and studied comparative literature in the United States at the University of Illinois and at the University of Chicago. And her concentration, not surprisingly, was in Russian literature. She then moved to Barcelona, where she writes for El País, The Nation, and Counterpunch, among others. As a translator of Czech and Russian literature into Spanish and Catalana, she is credited with bringing major 20th century writers to Spain. And I had to say, before I bring her up, and I'm going to just pause here, I'm really grateful that we're at 6 p.m. here on the East Coast, where many of us from Princeton are tuning in. But Monika is going to be tuning in for us live from Spain, where she does live. So it's almost midnight for her. And we're just really pleased that she's willing to stay up late to come on here and chat with us in this format. She was to have done a tour of the U.S. in person before the corona pandemic struck, and we were to have hosted her in person. And so being able to pivot and find a way to still promote and talk about this book is really wonderful. So another thing about Monika Zgustová is that she has written 8 books of fiction, 3 of nonfiction, and a play. So Dressed for a Dance in the Snow was published just a few months ago by Other Press. And it's her 4th book that she's written that has been translated into English. Previous titles in English include The Silent Woman and Goya's Glass and Fresh Mint with Lemon. And she has many other titles, and I hope they will get translated as well eventually. So as I said, we're so pleased that she is able to log on despite the time difference and be here with us online tonight. And I'm going to bring her up and I'm going to silence the chat. So one moment, please. Hi.
Hi. Hello, everybody.
Hello. Welcome. So actually, the other thing is that we actually attempted to do this a couple of weeks ago, and there was some kind of gremlins around in the internet that night, and it didn't go so well. So this is a reschedule of a rescheduled event. And third time is the charm, so it seems. And we have people saying that they're excited to be here and welcoming you onto our podcast. I guess it's not a podcast, it's a crowdcast. That's what it is. And right now you can hear my dog in the background. And that is the joy of working from home and in these types of pandemic conditions. Okay, so I'm going to disable the chat. And there we go. Okay, so just want to start out with a few questions and a reading and so forth. And so as I found out in preparing for this event tonight, you really started the research for this book all the way back in the fall of 2008. So 12 years ago was the impetus or the kernel of the thing that started this book out. It was on a trip to Moscow, and it was almost by serendipity that you were invited to this meeting of former prisoners of the Gulag, as I found out, and that's what started this book off. So do you think you might have come to write about this topic eventually, even if you had not gone to this meeting, given that much of your fiction writing has focused on women under totalitarianism regimes? Like, how important was this serendipitous meeting to you writing this book?
Well, I'm not sure if I would have written about this. It really was a serendipity because I found many women over there who really struck me as somebody very special. I actually expected to see people who would be absolutely run down and who wouldn't have energy, who wouldn't be laughing, eating, drinking. But actually, those women who were there, they were doing all these things, you know. And so there were like mainly women, some men also. The men were not so full of energy. They were like maybe a little bit more silent, more quiet. Whereas the women knew each other and, you know, immediately formed groups and talked to everybody, very happy to be there. And I really wished I could talk to them, to some of them, in order to know, to get to know their experience. Because I had read a lot about the Gulag until then, but not much about the women. I knew there were women in the Gulag, of course, but I didn't know that it was a massive experience for women also, that that women were massively sent to the Gulag. And I wanted to know whether it was a very harsh experience for women as well as for men, because I knew how horrible it was for men, that the Gulag was something like absolutely extraordinarily terrible. And so I was wondering how women would bear an experience like this, or whether maybe like the conditions were lighter for women than for men, you know. Right. And so I kind of tried to talk to them over there at the meeting of the ex-prisoners of the Gulag, but you know how it is at parties, that you can't really talk very deeply to anybody. It's more like small talk. And so I started asking for interviews, phone calls over there. And some of them were very happy to give me their phone number, and you know, they really encouraged me to come and see them and talk to them and all that. So first of all, I thought it would be just something for me, for myself, just to know, to get some more knowledge about this topic. And then as I talked to the first one, second one, I thought, well, maybe it should be an article, like an essay or something, no? But then I had only in Moscow, I had 6 women on my list, you know? And so when I talked to all 6 of them, I knew it would be a book. I thought, you know, I was sure that the topic was so interesting. The experiences were like, in many cases, in many details, were absolutely different one from another. And I was, you know, I thought I should write a book. And also my mother encouraged me greatly. And the book is dedicated to her, which I'm very happy about. My mother would always like kind of nag me. What about your book? What about your book? These women deserve to be heard about, to be written about. You have to make them visible. And so that's what I did.
Yeah, and making these voices visible is certainly what you have done. Why don't you start out by giving us a reading from a section of the book so we can get an idea of these voices?
Good idea.
Okay.
Okay, so I have like a couple of pages here prepared. This is one of the women who who had like the harshest experience in the Gulag. Her name is Elena Korybut-Dashkevich, and she also signs as Markova, and she had a absolutely horrible experience, but it will come out of my reading. Everything I achieved later in life, I owe to the few books that I managed to read in the Gulag. She concludes, Yelena concludes, and then exclaims, "No one can imagine what a book meant to the prisoners. It was salvation, beauty, liberty, and civilization in the midst of total barbarity. Oddly enough, my life developed exactly along the lines that the ancient shaman had predicted. After Stalin's death in 1953, and thanks to my mother's heroic efforts, the new authorities reduced my sentence to a kind of provisional freedom. I felt terribly let down because even though I left the Gulag, I was forced to live in the same area in Vorkuta. The worst part is that I wasn't allowed to register in the university, which is what mattered most to me. I had no work and no money. At last, thanks to the intervention of friends, I found work in a chemical laboratory in the city. It was there in Vorkuta that I married another ex-prisoner. My husband, a man of great humanity with a highly developed sense of ethics, worked as the director of the theater in Vorkuta. In 1954, I was given permission to enroll in correspondence courses at the Polytechnic University in Vorkuta. In 1960, when I moved to Moscow with my husband and my 3-year-old daughter, Inna, I had a diploma that made it possible for me to study in the Institute of Automatization and Cybernetics. I was 37 years old. When I got to the capital, I was confronted with an easygoing lifestyle that was very different from what I had known in Vorkuta, which had become a refuge for prisoners or ex-prisoners of the Gulag. I had to adapt to this new mentality, but I never got used to its superficiality. People complained about insignificant things and led shallow lives without really giving any thought to what mattered. I think the Gulag helped me find a sense of values to distinguish between what was meaningful and what was trivial. I focused on my studies and later on my work, taking advantage of every minute, almost every second, to do something worthwhile. If I was traveling by metro, for example, I always carried a book of art or philosophy, or especially the classics, whether they were Russian or universal, and I took advantage of the time to read and to learn. I didn't go to cafes or restaurants with my friends. I preferred to dedicate all my time to my work. I became a specialist in cybernetics and computer technology. I published a number of books in that area and participated in many international conferences in the Western capitals as one of the few women in that field. I didn't retire until I was 80, but I keep writing scientific articles as well as texts about my experience in the Gulag. I want to die as a person whose merits have been recognized and surrounded by my family. So this is what Elena Korybut-Dashkevich said to me when I interviewed her. And I must tell you one interesting thing. Actually, Elena turned 97 years old last week. And I was on a Zoom conference with her, and I could tell her happy birthday.
Wow. So she's 97. And what were the years that she was in the Gulag when she was in her 30s?
Well, she was like 18 when she first got there. She couldn't go to
Okay.
the university. Instead of going to the university, which she wanted to do, she went to the Gulag. She was sent to the Gulag, and she stayed there until she stayed there for many years until she was almost 40.
Wow. That's a long time to spend in that condition.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah. So, I mean, there's so many great stories in this book. And, I think as uh, a librarian and anybody who is a lover of the literature and of the arts, I mean, a central theme, of course, in this book is about how things such as the arts and the spoken word was the saving grace for a lot of these women who were in the Gulag. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Yes. These women were living in like the harshest conditions. This is what I learned, that when I was talking to them, I learned that it wasn't just men who lived in terrible conditions, but also women. Actually, I would say that women lived in as bad conditions as men did, but maybe it was even worse for them, because they were exposed also like to violence, to rapes, and all kinds of like sexual exploitation. They didn't talk to me about it really directly, because they are from a generation which didn't really like to talk about these things. But I could understand it, and I understood that I couldn't really say it in my book because they didn't say it to me. But this is something which I learned from the Nobel Prize winner Svetlana Alexievich. She told me in one private conversation that when I asked her how I should solve this question, she said, just let it clear to the reader, but without saying anything. Make it clear, just because just by silences. That's all. Nothing else, and the readers will understand it. And I think they do. So the conditions were very, very, very absolutely harsh, and I. So this is what I did with them. And I learned one more thing, that the interesting thing about these women was that the more cultured these women were, the more, just a minute. Sorry. The more I think the easier stay they had, because, for example, they knew poetry, they knew literature, they were well read and all that. So these things helped them very much. They shared their experiences, literary experiences, and all that. And for example, while they were walking to the camp, to their work, which usually was like a long time, like maybe an hour walking there and another hour, which was also like terrible. It was very, very cold, and they had to go in files. But anyway, it was very terrible. And so during this time, they would tell stories to each other. They would tell poetry, verses to each other, and other women would memorize them. And by memorizing them, they had their head occupied, and they didn't think about the horror that they were living through. And by this also, they were creating friendships. So the friendship was very, very important to them. So it was mainly like culture, friendship, and love. But I would say love. How come, right? Because the camps usually for women and men were separated in most cases, but sometimes they would get a glimpse of a man, or the man of the women. One of the women would tell me that she wrote little pieces of poetry and would stick it in the wall. And a man from a male camp would get it from between the stones, from the wall. And, so this was their way of communication, So I got these beautiful things. So my book is about rough experiences, but it's mainly about human resilience, how people are really able to get over even the most terrible experience. People are very strong. We are much stronger human beings. We as human beings are much stronger than what we think. So, there are many things that can help us, and especially other human beings, our friends, can help us a lot. That's what these women discovered, and that's what they cultivated all their life.
Yeah, I mean, it's very telling that, as I said, so it was 2008 that you went to this party where the former prisoners of the Gulag were still regularly gathering. And so that is a testament that, many years after their release from these conditions, they still maintained that network and that friendship and that support of each other, of that shared experience. And I think you're right, human beings are resilient, and the times that test you often make you better. So how much so in 2013 you wrote a novel, Valya's Night, and I don't think that one's been translated yet. So Valya's Night, though, based on the description, how much of that was based on the research that you were doing at the time of Dress for a Dance in the Snow? Because it is taking place in similar conditions. And is there any chance that this book will be translated into English? Because I really want to read it.
Well, I would like it to be translated in English, and I hope it will be. I haven't talked about it to my publisher yet, so hopefully she might get thrilled by the topic. Yes, this is a novel which I wrote. It is different than Dressed for a Dance in the Snow, which is a book of interviews. It is actually written more like maybe like a journalistic book, or well, these are stories of women, but it's mainly like written as nonfiction. Whereas Valya's Night is based on reality, but it is fiction. It's a novel. And here I wrote about one of the women who are in my book. Her name is Valentina Iyevleva, and she is Valya, Valentina Valya, and she. I got caught up by her experience, because she started telling me, well, when I was 17, I met an American man, an American Marine, who was in my city in the north of Russia as a soldier. So, I was wondering about this part of her story. What happened, this was during the Second World War, when Valya was 17, and this man was also, he was during his military service, so he must have been around 20. And these soldiers were on American and British ships bringing aid to Russia, mainly like weapons, but also food and all kinds of help, so that they would fight against the Nazi occupation, against the Nazi troops, right? So they were on the same side, of course, and so. at that time, this Valentina or Valia met this charming American man whose name was Bill, and they fell in love, and then he had to go away, and she became pregnant. She was pregnant by then, and had a baby, and then Stalin became his purge in the late 40s. And so Valia was arrested, and she was taken to jail. And she was accused of being a pro-American spy. This was like a very normal accusation to be that, somebody who was absolutely an innocent and harmless human being, that, he was accused, or she was accused of being a pro-Western spy. So that was also like Valia's accusation, and she couldn't say anything. It was a trial without really, you couldn't say anything over there. She had no lawyer or nothing, and she was sent after that to the Gulag for about 20 years. Yes, 20 years, and she was from her city of Arkhangelsk. She went even further to the north, beyond the Arctic Circle, and so that's where she worked in. Like usually they were. I must tell you one thing, that Valentina is also in this book. So I'm not talking about something that people cannot read. This is right. Story that you can read, even with Bill over there, and everything is in this book. After that, I made Valia into a novel in a more novelistic way, but her story, told by herself, is in my book. She had a very difficult life. After that, she fell in love many other times. And that was her, that kind of saved her life sometimes, but also made it much more difficult at other times. And at the end of her life, after she was let out of the Gulag, she couldn't go to the university. She couldn't do anything special with her life, like Elena that I just read about. She was a specialist in cybernetics. So not Valentina. Valentina was a person who did like menial jobs, but she liked to read very much. So almost every day she read a book. She had her apartment full of books. There are some pictures that she can't even walk in her apartment.
Wow.
So full of books, so like books everywhere. And she said that the life she couldn't live normally, she lived it through books, And this is not an uncommon story. Many women that were in the Gulag, that were sentenced to the Gulag and stayed there for 10, 15, 20, even 25 years, many of them really loved to read, because like reading was extremely appreciated. They usually didn't have books over there, but sometimes it happened that they had access to a book. It was like a miracle. For example, Valentina herself told me that she was in a hospital because she was hurt while she was working. And so while she was in the hospital, there was only one book, and it was Tolstoy, War and Peace. And so she read this book 3 times, one after another. Yes, and she would have wanted to memorize everything for herself, but also for her friends, because all of these women like to share their culture and their experience, the cultural experiences with others. Elena told me, for example, she was from a very cultured family. Actually, she was from Polish nobility, and so she knew very much about classical music, opera, and all that. She knew some of the arias by heart. And once she met somebody who she could sing with, and they started to sing together. She said she was so thrilled for like 2 or 3 days. This made her days. Wow. And she was a very happy person, and even worked in a happier way than normally. As far as work is concerned, these women worked for many, many hours. It was always at least 12 hours, and sometimes even 14. And usually it was like at least half an hour, like going there and going back. But sometimes it could have been 2 hours just going there and going back. They slept usually without any heat. They had just one set of clothes. They didn't have pajamas or anything like that to change for the night. There's also one very interesting thing that I would like to share with you. And it's that the women who survive in the best way and who survive, were those who took the best care of themselves. So just imagine that you come back from working for 12 hours and plus 2 more hours walking, right? 14 hours of walking plus hard work. You're absolutely exhausted, but instead of lying down in your bed and collapsing and sleeping, that's it. Some women went and washed themselves, washed their clothes, and cleaned their clothes. Took out like all the mud and everything that was caught in it, and tried to iron it even. Although they knew that after that they would go and lie in bed in the same clothes, right? The same pants, whatever, and. But still, it helped them to feel clean, to feel human. This was extremely important because it dignified them. This was the question of they feel dignified as human beings when they did these things.
Yes, and keeping your dignity is important. So 2 things. One is I'm going to ask you, do you have another section to read for us?
Well, I haven't prepared anything, but I can. Yes, I could read here one thing about why this book is called. People sometimes ask me why this book is called "Dressed for a Dance in the Snow."
That was my other question, was what can you tell us about the title and why you chose that title? So you're like a mind reader here. And also anybody who's online with us, don't forget there's the ask a question button, because we're going to be doing some other questions, so feel free. So you can read us the section about why the title is Dressed for a Dance in the Snow. That would be really great.
Okay. So there are 2 students, 2 sisters. They live together in the same house. They have no parents because their parents had been taken to the Gulag and sentenced to be killed for political reasons 10 years before in another Stalin's purge. So here starts the fragment from my book. This is the first story, the one of Zayara Visiole. The celebration of Gaira's successful thesis defense was originally planned for Saturday, but for some reason I had insisted that we have it on Friday. I got my way. It's as if I knew that Saturday would be too late to celebrate anything. It was a Friday in 1949. My older sister Gaira and I bought cold cuts, cheese, sausages, lots of bread, and of course, wine. Once we got home, we put a clean cloth on the table where we laid out this food that we could enjoy only on special occasions. Our student grants were limited, along with cups and glasses for the warm wine. Gaira decorated the table with a bouquet of birch branches whose leaves were turning a springtime green. We used an empty milk bottle for a vase. Then we stood back to take in the sight of the festive table. The guests began to show up one by one. Gaira and I were used to having people over. About 10 years earlier, in the time of the Great Purges, they arrested and then shot our father, the writer Artyom Vesioli, for being an enemy of the people. And a few years after taking him, they sent our mother to a concentration camp because she was his wife. After that, my sister and I shared a room in a kommunalka, a communal apartment. Since our home was right in downtown Moscow, in the Arbat area, at night it would fill up with students. We would recite poetry, mainly Vladimir Mayakovsky, poems I knew by heart, listen to music, and dance. We served tea and toast and plain cookies. It was all we could afford, except when Minka, my best friend, who lived at home with her parents and spent her student grant as she liked, brought us something to nibble on. The first guest had sat down at the table. Gaira and I were preparing the wine. We poured the cheap bottle into a clean pot, added a little water and sugar, and seasoned it with cinnamon, clove, walnut, and orange peel we had gotten from a fruit stand and dried. As it boiled, this elixir gave off an aromatic vapor. All around the table, the guests breathed in the sweet, spicy smell of the alcohol. They couldn't wait to try it. The celebration was wonderful. We recited poetry and danced, and no one wanted to go home, but the metro stopped running at 12. So most of our company said goodbye just before midnight. 5 people were left, my sister and me, the 2 hostesses, Minka and 2 boys, Oleg and Dima. When we had finished the mulled wine, we fixed sweet, strong black tea. The stragglers drank their tea and argued and laughed as though they wanted to spend the whole night talking and listening to music and dancing. Suddenly we heard loud knocks on the door. It was 2:15. Gaira and I looked at each other. It was the way they had come for our mother. I went out to open the door. I was escorted back by 5 armed policemen, with the porter and his wife following behind. One of the policemen, the youngest, introduced himself. I'm Commander Potapov. He looked around and joked. Are you having an Easter celebration? I wasn't amused. Who did they think they were? Did they take us for old people? We are celebrating because we have passed our exams, Gaia answered. Oh, very nice, the commander said. And which one of you is Zayara Visyolaya? The commander showed me the warrant for my arrest. So, the title of the book actually comes from the first book, the first story, the one about Zayara, and also the last one. Zayara was dressed for a dance, for her party with dancing, as she repeated several times. She liked to dance. And then in that very clothes, she was taken to jail and from where she spent like 2 months. And from there, she took a very difficult train trip, which took about 2 to 3 weeks. And still in the same clothes, she was taken to Siberia, to the snow of Siberia. So she was dressed for a dance, and she was in the snow. And the same story happened to the last woman. Her name was Irina Yemelyanova. And this Irina was the daughter of Olga Ivinskaya, who was the last love of Boris Pasternak, the author of Dr. Zhivago. She was in the Gulag. She had to go to the Gulag precisely because of Pasternak, and because of Dr. Zhivago, because the Russian authorities didn't like the treatment of Russian history in Dr. Zhivago. And so, although Pasternak was dead by then, Irina, just because of being the daughter of his lover, was sentenced to a Gulag. And same story. She was taken at a party. She was wearing some beautiful clothes and some very nice and fashionable little coats for spring. And in that clothes, she was taken to the snows of Siberia. So, well, that's what happened during those times. And these are like little fragments from the stories my women told me.
So we're going to get to the questions. Hang on, let me bring myself back up here. And so how many women in total did you interview for the book?
I interviewed 9 women. As I said, 6 of them I interviewed in Moscow, and 3 of them, 2 of them in Paris, and 1 in London. The interesting thing I would like to tell you, that there is one woman about whom Joan Baez wrote a song, and that yes, it is a cute story. That song is called For Natalia, or For Natalia Gorbanevskaya. That's the full name of this woman, because she was a real heroine. She was a dissident. She always fought for the rights of individuals in Russia, and of course, all that was in the even in the 60s and 70s, after Stalin's death. All this was strictly prohibited, and so she was taken not to the Gulag, but to something which she said was even worse, and that was what the Russians called Psikhushka, and that means the psychiatric hospital, where she was fed drugs which destroy your brain. And so she felt, most of the time, she felt like out of her mind. It was very difficult to survive from the mental viewpoint. So this was like also one of the harshest experiences. I actually talked to 9 different women because some of them have very different experiences. Like, for example, this Natalia, who was younger than the rest of them, and she was in this psychiatric hospital. Then another one was Polish, and she was taken from Poland to the Russian Gulag. And so, like different stories, so that people could see how history worked, because we can read books of history, but the like one part of history are also like people's stories, how they tell them, how they lived through history. I like this kind of history because to know how people lived through it, it's not just numbers in in a textbook.
Yeah.
But it's like really human stories that we can identify with.
Yeah, it's real oral history. It's getting those stories. So we do have a question here coming in from Jake Robertson, and Jake wants to know: when you were doing this, did you have in your research any contact with prisoners who were there for non-political crimes? Like, did you have female? He's calling it URCAs, career criminals, or were all of the people that you met for this project there for political reasons?
And no, I only had actually political prisoners, because I only wanted women, because women were less known, much less known. We know much more about men mainly from the work of Solzhenitsyn. But I wanted I wanted these women to speak up for themselves, because they were the last women I could actually interview. And there weren't too many women survivors at the time when I was there. It was so it was almost by chance. It was like the last generation I could still grab an interview. And the funny thing is, like, well, it's not that I didn't want to take somebody who wouldn't be a political prisoner. I would have liked that too. By the way, in the story of Valentina, she speaks very much about the common prisoners. Sometimes she got along with them, sometimes very well, and she was their friend. So we can learn something about their experiences. The thing is that actually they died earlier than the political prisoners, because I think I started touching upon this, that the people who were like less cultivated and less educated, they didn't survive that well in the Gulag as the political prisoners who were more cultured. Why? Because culture really helped people very much to survive. And also, there was one more thing, which is very, very interesting. The political prisoners knew that actually they were innocent, and the feeling of their own innocence, that they are in jail and they are sentenced to forced labor, but they haven't committed anything against the law, helped them survive. Actually, it was good for them. It was very good for them. This feeling of innocence, it worked miracles.
Yeah, very, very interesting. And I mean, I really found, Irina Emilionova's story to be very interesting. I hadn't realized that simply by being the daughter of Boris Pasternak, that was considered enough to send somebody to the Gulag, that she had been protected while he was alive. And then once he was gone, that, she could be sent, and both she and her mother were sent there because of their affiliation with him. Yeah. And that was all that it took to get you sent. Indeed, they were. And it is, again, so interesting that things like a love of literature and art and culture, but I think also maybe if you were there as a political prisoner, as you said, that sense of innocence helped you through. Maybe it was also a sense of rage, like, I'm going to get through this because I'm here unjustly. Yes. And the support that they could build because of their shared culture. So we don't really have any other questions coming in. And so is there anything else that we need to say in closing? Is there anything that we're missing from the conversation here? I mean, I really do encourage everybody here. As you can see, the link is there. Labyrinth can order this book and have it for you at a discount. The library does have a copy in our collection. Unfortunately, the library is not open at the time, and it's a print copy. But once we open again, it will be there for you to read. I don't know if we got it cataloged before we closed. So anyhow, but I had an advanced copy that I got to read. Oh, we have another question here. Let me see. A comment to thanking you for preserving these incredible stories. What was the average age of the stories that you were interviewing?
Well, it was about like 80. Most of the women were 80 or over 80. And I think the youngest one were like a little bit after 70. So, yeah, it was, yeah, people, you know, who lived through history, right? And so I felt kind of like I could touch history through them, you know. And also, I would like to tell you that there were, don't think that this is a topic which is far away from you, because there were Americans in the Gulag also. And one or two are in my book. Yes, there were people from many other countries also, many other nations. For example, there was Pasternak's wife. I mean, yes, Pasternak's love was there, but I meant to say Prokofiev, the musician. Prokofiev's wife was also in the Gulag, and one of the women I interviewed met her there, and so her story is also in it. She was of Spanish origin, but she lived for quite some time in America and in Paris. She was an international lady. So these are like all kinds of stories are in the book. Yeah.
Who wants to know? Hannah wants to know: have you written about Czech literature, especially with view of your interest in political issues? So Czech literature, is that something that's in your area?
Yes, of course. I teach Czech literature, and I have translated into Spanish and Catalan many books, like 50 books from Czech literature. The great classics like Hašek and Hrabal and Kundera. You name it. This one that's here behind me, Jaroslav Seifert also. And plus in my novels, I write sometimes on Russian topics, but also on Czech topics, from Czech history, mainly like 20th century. As you said, you know, I speak very often in my books about women and totalitarianism. So it's usually from the times of totalitarianism, either Nazi or communist. Stories that I heard from my grandparents and my parents. I treat them in my books.
Right. Now, what are you working on next?
Right now, I'm working on 2 books, which deal with the relationship of mothers and daughters. And it's that, but it's also about exile. You know, how exile, because I'm an exile, actually my parents were exiled into the United States, right? And I was a kid, 16 years old when I got to the States, and so like exile it's very important for anybody who has had this experience, cannot forget it. And so this is also like another topic which is always in one way or another in my stories, in my books, in my novels, and my essays and nonfiction. So right now I'm writing about like violence, psychological violence that can be created in family.
Okay. So we have one more question and comment, and then we're going to sign off because our hour is nearly up. So the question comes in, it's been voted up. Have you ever spoken to the women in general about Gulag theater, such as in Vorkuta? So did they talk to you about theater in the Gulag?
Yes, of course. It was very, very important. In precisely the woman that I that I read the one of the fragments about, Elena, the first fragment. She lived in Vorkuta for about 10 years after being let out of the Gulag. She was like, she wasn't free, but she wasn't hard labor anymore. She got married to somebody who was a director of that theater in Vorkuta, which is very, very important theater there. And actually, you know, some very good actors came out of there. Yes, it was a whole institution, and this is a very good question because it was theater in Vorkuta, and also in some of the camps they had theater. Most of the time it was just to celebrate the communist festivals, right? But still they could make something out of it. You know, there were prisoners who were acting, they were reciting poems, they were maybe acting in a play. And this was a huge feast for somebody who was used to working 7 days a week. All those hours I told you about, you know. So yes, some theater, some creativity was extremely important. They usually didn't have paper and pen, but they memorized whatever they created in their head. They memorized it. They talked about it to other people, and you know, these some of these poems or short stories survived, and they have been published, and we can read them.
Wow, that's amazing. Okay, so I think we're going to end here. This has been a really fascinating conversation. So glad that it worked out and that we persevered, for the third time being the charm. I'm going to finish with a comment coming in through the question thing, who's from Pam, who says, I don't have a question, but I just wanted to say that this was a very interesting presentation. It was really wonderful to hear Monika make these women come alive. You can tell that she is passionate about what she writes about, and this presentation made it come through. And so that is very, very true. And it was a perfect way to end this broadcast. I've enabled the chat room if anybody wants to leave messages. Monika can see you writing in there as we wrap up an episode. We have many more events scheduled here at the library on Crowdcast, as does Labyrinth, so check out both of our pages. As I said, we're going to be working together hand in hand, the library and Labyrinth books. Also, Dressed for a Dance in the Snow came out through Other Press, and Jessica Greer is the publicist for that I work with, and I'm talking to Jessica about setting up some more interviews with authors from the Other Press, and we have lots of people saying thank you. This is amazing and compelling work, and I'm really grateful that you captured these books, these women's voices in your books. You know, as you said, it was always written. Anything I've read about this has been from the perspective of the men, and to have this done is a really big service. So thank you so much. And I think that's all from the library. It's 1 o'clock in the morning for you, Monika. Mm-hmm. So you can go ahead, post to the United States. Thank you for your time and your effort to make this come alive for us tonight.
Thanks for having me. It was wonderful. It was such a pleasure. And thanks to everybody for your questions, for your comments, and thanks for listening to me. It was just fantastic. And I just hope, the only thing I hope, to be able to one day be able to be at Princeton Public Library.
Yes, hopefully maybe on your next book tour, you can come on over and visit us in person. I would love that.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay. Thank you. Good night, everybody.
Good night, everybody. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.